So who was Jesus? Was he a fictional character? Some people say he was a guru, he was a new ager, he was a sage, a wise man. Because after all, he didn't really say he was God, did he? Now, the book of John makes it pretty clear that's who Jesus was. But people say, yeah, but that's a separate gospel. You have the three gospels, and it's kind of fuzzy what's going on there. Why didn't Jesus just stand in front of the synagogue one day and put his arms out and say, I'm God? Well, here are some of the reasons I think that he didn't do it. One is, you've got a lot of politics during this time. You've got to be really, really careful. You've got the Roman Empire there. And you've got different groups of people in power, and I think Jesus was trying to avoid the political upheaval that would come with some statement like that. Secondly, think about the confusion there is. If he says, I'm God, the Jews think of God as the being up in heaven. What's he doing on earth? What's he doing with flesh? And all of a sudden the whole Trinity thing comes into play. And I don't think that was Jesus' purpose to get into these kinds of debates. And then thirdly, Jesus is here in a subordinate role, isn't he? He says the Father is greater than I. And so, in a sense, he's carrying out the Father's duties that he came to earth for. But there's all sorts of indirect evidence. If you take a look at the things that Jesus said about himself, he says, I am. He's using a reference to the Old Testament, God saying, I am, when Moses talks to him. And the Jews knew what he was talking about, because they were going to pick up stones to kill him because of what he had to say. I am the Father of one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Really? These are amazing statements coming from some ordinary human. What he did was amazing. He accepted worship. No Jew was to worship. In the Old Testament, when angels showed up and people would start to worship, the angel would say, get up, don't worship me. Only worship God. And yet Jesus accepted worship from his followers. He told people their sins were forgiven. How does that come off from some average, ordinary, earthly person? Think about the reactions of other people. What does Thomas say when he sees the wounds on Jesus? He says, my Lord and my God. I think that's a really powerful scene. That's something that we can take groups to, different religious groups who don't think Jesus is God. They think he's a created being. But Thomas didn't think so. He says, my Lord and my God. I mean, even the Talmud, written years later, looking back and reflecting on this, said Jesus was some kind of, what would you say, a guy that deserved death. He was a sorcerer of some kind. Because what are they doing? They're admitting that he was doing all sorts of miraculous things. Let me just share one place in Romans that illustrates that these writers, these apostles, these people that had encountered Jesus, whether in the flesh or like Paul did later, they knew who he was. They knew that he was God. So in chapter 10 of Romans, Paul says this, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. Now, he says if you'll say with your mouth Jesus is Lord. Well, some people say, okay, but that just means Jesus is my master, Jesus is a great person. Lord can mean several different things, and that is true. But if you stay in that very same section in chapter 10, go down about 3 more verses, and Paul is saying, this is verse 12, the same Lord is Lord of all, and richly blesses all who call on him for, now he's going to quote Joel, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And guess what? The same Greek word for Lord is being used there as when Paul says Jesus is Lord. That verse from Joel is referring to Jehovah God. So here is Paul saying, you have to believe Jesus is Jehovah God. In 3 verses later he says, that's what Joel is saying. One more time. Everyone who calls on the name of the Jehovah God will be saved. So, who is Jesus? Well, I think we have 4 choices. And I'm kind of updating C.S. Lewis. Liar, maybe. Lunatic, possible. Now I'm going to add a 3rd one. Legend or Lord. And I don't have time to go into all those, but I think if you take a look at those first 3, Jesus is certainly not legend. Early testimony to who he was. References to other people from the outside talking about Jesus. Is he a liar? Who's going to follow a liar? Is it a lunatic? Who's going to follow a lunatic? I think we're left with, out of those four, the last one, Jesus is Lord.